They say that you never truly know a person until you're standing in the wreckage of what you thought was a permanent life. I spent 30 years thinking I understood the man sleeping beside me, but as I stood in our kitchen this morning, staring at the man who had systematically dismantled my self-worth for the better part of a decade, I realized I didn't know him at all. Or maybe I had just been choosing not to see the monster hiding in plain sight. How can someone look you dead in the eye, knowing they've burned your marriage to the ground, and ask you to hold their hand while they prepare to chase someone else? It's a level of audacity that defies logic, yet it was playing out in real time, right there over a cup of lukewarm coffee. I'm 52 years old. My husband is 56. For years, I was the one keeping the lights on, the one paying the mortgage, the one ensuring our lives didn't crumble under the weight of financial neglect. And while I was working myself to the bone to provide a stable foundation, he was busy curating a digital fantasy life, swiping right on faces young enough to be our children, telling me it was an addiction he couldn't control. And now, today, he had the gall to ask for a favor that felt like a final, twisted insult. But to understand why I refused, to understand why my heart had finally turned to stone, we have to go back to the moment I realized my husband wasn't just a partner anymore. He was a parasite. I didn't always see it that way. In the beginning, we were a team. I was the breadwinner, yes, but there was a balance to it. I handled the big bills, the mortgage, the utilities, the insurance, while he handled his own personal expenses, his car note, his phone bill. It felt fair enough at the time. I was proud of my career, and he was supposed to be my equal, my emotional anchor. But somewhere along the line, the anchor became a weight. It started with the subtle shifts in his behavior. He started spending more time on his phone, the blue light reflecting in his eyes late at night, his thumb moving in that rhythmic, predatory swipe. I thought it was just boredom. I thought it was just a man going through a midlife crisis, something we could weather together with therapy and patience. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. It wasn't just boredom. It was an obsession. He wasn't just scrolling. He was actively searching for an exit strategy. And he was doing it with women who hadn't even been born when we took our vows. Every time I confronted him, the script remained the same. He would shrink, look down at his shoes, and whisper that he was addicted, that he couldn't help himself, that it was a compulsion, a medical issue, something outside of his control. He made me feel like the villain for questioning him, as if my desire for loyalty was somehow stifling his medical condition. But the reality was much colder. He wasn't sick. He was just finished with me. Yet he was too comfortable to leave. I was his bank, his housekeeper, his safety net. I was the woman who paid for his life, while he looked for the woman who would replace me. And yet, there we were, still sharing a roof, while the lawyers drafted the paperwork for our divorce. The tension in our home had become physical, a thick, suffocating fog that filled every room. I walked on eggshells. He walked with a sense of entitlement that made my blood run cold, and we both pretended that we weren't just waiting for the clock to run out. Then came this morning. He walked into the kitchen, his posture relaxed in a way that made me want to scream. He looked at me, not with the hatred of a man whose marriage is ending, but with the casual indifference of a roommate asking for a favor. He told me he'd finally scheduled his vasectomy. He wanted to know if I would drive him to the clinic, wait for him in the recovery area, and drive him home. I stopped reading for a second. I looked at his face, searching for a trace of irony, a shred of shame, but there was nothing, just that vacant, expectant stare. I stood there, the weight of 1,000 betrayed promises pressing down on my chest, and I realized that he didn't just want me to drive him. He wanted me to be complicit. He wanted me to participate in his transition into his next life, a life where he would be free to pursue those young women he spent so many nights chasing. My voice was quiet, almost hollow, when I finally spoke. I told him no. I told him it was an insensitive, cruel request. I thought that would be enough. I thought he would see the absurdity of it, but he didn't. He bristled, his face twisting into that familiar expression of defensive outrage. He told me it was a medical procedure, that he would be in pain, that he needed someone there to ensure he got home safely. He made it sound like I was abandoning a comrade in arms, rather than refusing to facilitate the very thing that signified the end of my dignity. It's a medical procedure, and I'll be in a lot of pain, he snapped, his voice rising. I looked at him, and for the first time in years, the fear was gone. The obligation was gone. There was only the cold, hard truth. I told him exactly what it was. I said, "It's a procedure for you to not have to worry about pregnancy scares, so you can go out and sleep with younger women." The silence that followed was deafening. The air in the kitchen seemed to grow heavy, pressurized by the weight of the words I'd just dropped like a lead anchor into the room. He didn't look at me with regret or apology. Instead, he looked at me with that practiced, wounded expression he'd perfected over the years. The one designed to make me feel like the aggressor, the nag, the woman who was just too sensitive to understand the realities of his life. "You're being cruel," he muttered, turning away to pour himself a cup of coffee with a shaking hand that I wasn't entirely sure was genuine. "It's a simple surgery. It's about my health. Why does everything have to be about your insecurities? You're making this into something it isn't." I stared at his back. He was wearing that faded gray sweater I'd bought him for Christmas 2 years ago. The same year he'd spent half the holiday in the guest room, working, while the apps hummed with notifications on his phone. It was almost laughable. The audacity of him to lecture me on insecurity when he was the architect of every single one I possessed. "My insecurities?" I repeated, my voice steady, gaining strength with every syllable. "You spent years making it clear that I'm not enough, that I'm too old, that you need something else. And now you want me to assist in the logistics of your new life? You're asking me to be the chauffeur for your next affair. That isn't about my insecurities. That's about your complete lack of respect for the woman who has kept a roof over your head for the last decade." He turned back around, his face flushing a mottled red. He started listing the reasons why a partner, even a divorcing one, should do this for the other. He talked about human decency and basic kindness. He threw around terms like medical necessity as if he were undergoing heart surgery rather than a procedure he was explicitly choosing to make his future bachelorhood more convenient. It was a strange moment of clarity for me. For years, I had been the one to apologize. I had been the one to walk on eggshells, to hide my hurt, to bury my resentment so that he wouldn't get upset. I had spent so long trying to be the bigger person that I had essentially erased myself. But as he stood there, demanding that I prioritize his comfort over my own shattered self-worth, the switch finally flipped. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the gray at his temples, the lines around his eyes that I had once found comforting and familiar, and realized they were just markers of time he had wasted. I realized that my refusal wasn't about being petty. If he had come to me with a health crisis, a real illness, an injury, something that actually mattered, I would have been there. I would have put my resentment in a box and helped him, because that's who I am. I'm a person who cares. But this was different. This was the final step in his detachment from the life we built. And he wanted me to witness it, to facilitate it, to give it my blessing. "I wouldn't be doing this if it were anything else," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "If you were sick, if you were in pain from anything other than your own pursuit of a lifestyle that involves hurting me, I would be there. But I am not going to help you prepare to live the life you've been lying to me about for years. You want this? You find a friend. You call a ride service. You figure it out on your own. You've been looking for independence for years. Well, here it is. This is what independence looks like." He exploded then. He started shouting about how I was petty, how I was vindictive, how I was the reason the marriage failed because I couldn't let things go. The vitriol poured out of him, a torrent of blame that was so familiar I could have recited it in my sleep. He called me heartless. He accused me of being a monster. And you know what? For the first time, it didn't hurt. It didn't make me cry. It didn't make me want to apologize. it just made me feel relieved. Because every hateful word he screamed at me just confirmed that I was making the right choice. I didn't argue back. I didn't defend myself. I just picked up my purse, grabbed my keys, and walked toward the door. I had a job to go to. A job that paid for that very house he was currently stomping around in. As I reached for the doorknob, he followed me, still yelling, his face contorted in a way that made him look like a stranger. "You're really going to walk out?" he yelled. "You're going to leave me here to fend for myself?" I stopped and looked over my shoulder, catching his gaze one last time. "You've been fending for yourself for a long time, in every way that counts," I said. And then I stepped out into the morning air. The silence of my car as I drove to work was the most beautiful thing I had heard in years. No arguing, no gaslighting, no accusations, just the hum of the road. But as I pulled into my office parking lot, the weight of everything started to settle in. I thought about the house, about the pending divorce, about the fact that I still had to go home to him tonight. The monster was still there. And he was going to be even angrier when I returned. The drive back home that evening felt like I was heading toward a battlefield, even though the war was technically over. I sat in my parked car in the driveway for a long time, watching the dim light flickering in the living room window. For years, this house had felt like a sanctuary, but now it felt more like a cage. Every brick, every piece of furniture, every framed memory on the wall seemed to hold the ghost of a version of myself that didn't exist anymore. A version of myself that was still trying to keep him happy. I finally killed the engine, and the silence that followed was absolute. My heart was thumping, not out of fear, but out of a sudden sharp realization of how much energy I had wasted on this man. He wasn't a partner. He was an anchor. A heavy, rusting chain dragging me down into the depths of a midlife I had once imagined would be peaceful, fulfilling, and shared. As I walked through the front door, the air was thick with a familiar, suffocating tension. He was sitting on the couch, the television blaring, his phone held inches from his face. He didn't even look up when I entered. It was his way of letting me know he was still punishing me for my defiance earlier that morning. That was his primary tactic, the silent treatment, the cold shoulder, the performance of the aggrieved husband. It used to make me feel small. It used to make me rush to apologize, to offer dinner, to try and fix whatever wrong I had committed by having a spine. Tonight, I just hung up my coat and walked past him toward the kitchen. I wasn't going to feed into the performance. I wasn't going to ask him if he wanted anything. I wasn't going to check if he'd had a hard day at his job. My world had narrowed down to one singular focus: getting through this transitional period without losing myself entirely. He didn't speak for an hour. Then, as I was pouring a glass of water, he stood up and walked into the kitchen, his voice dripping with that condescending, wounded tone he'd spent decades perfecting. "I hope you're happy," he said, not looking at me, but leaning against the counter in a way that made him look like he was preparing for a lecture. "You've made it very clear today that you don't care about my well-being. It's funny, really. All that talk about for better or worse, all those vows you took so seriously. It turns out they were conditional. They were only for as long as I served a purpose for you." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I turned to look at him, and I didn't see the man I'd married. I saw a man who was terrified. He was terrified because for the first time, he was seeing the cracks in his own leverage. He was terrified because the woman who had always been the predictable, nurturing, financially stable constant in his life had finally, irrevocably, said no. "You want to talk about conditions?" I asked, my voice calm, almost detached. My vows were based on the idea that we were a team. They were based on the idea of mutual respect, of building something together. You broke those conditions the moment you decided that I was just the support staff for your secret digital life. You didn't just break a vow. You broke the foundation of who we were. You don't get to demand for better or worse when you've spent years actively making everything worse for me. He opened his mouth to interrupt, probably to start in on the addiction excuse again. but I didn't give him the floor. "I'm not your nurse," I continued, feeling a rush of cold, clean power. "I'm not your secretary, and I'm certainly not your enabler. If you want a vasectomy, you have the right to get one. I'm not standing in your way. But you don't get to use me to make your life more comfortable while you're busy tearing mine apart. If you're so addicted to your lifestyle, then you can find someone else to hold your hand through it. Maybe one of those women you're so fond of messaging. Surely one of them would be happy to help." His face paled, then flushed a deep, ugly crimson. He started pacing the kitchen, his movements erratic, his breathing heavy. It was a tantrum, pure and simple. The tantrum of a man who had realized he'd lost his grip on the narrative. He started listing the ways I had failed him, the ways I wasn't fun enough, the ways I wasn't supportive enough. It was a greatest hits album of his insecurities, a tired, repetitive song that I had heard 100 times before. But this time, I wasn't listening. I was thinking about the bank accounts I'd already started separating. I was thinking about the phone call I'd made to the real estate agent earlier that afternoon. I was thinking about the fact that soon, sooner than he expected, this house would be sold, and he would be someone else's problem. "I'm going to bed," I said, cutting him off mid-sentence. "We aren't finished talking," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "I am," I replied. As I walked toward the bedroom, I could hear him behind me, sputtering, searching for a way to regain control, to pull me back into the emotional quicksand where he'd held me captive for so long. But I kept walking. I closed the bedroom door and locked it. It was the first time in 30 years I'd ever locked him out of our room, and as the latch clicked into place, it sounded like the most liberating thing I had ever heard. I lay in the dark, listening to him stomp around in the living room, hearing the muffled sound of him venting to a friend or perhaps typing out another message on one of his apps, desperate for validation. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt a spark of something I thought had died years ago. Peace. The next few days felt like a bizarre, slow-motion ending to a play I'd been performing in for 3 decades. The house was a minefield of awkward silences and deliberate maneuvers to avoid one another. He would stomp through the rooms, making a point to slam cabinets and sigh loudly, like a petulant child being sent to his room for a timeout. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see me break, to see me crawl back into the role of the devoted, doting, enabling wife who would apologize for having a boundary. But he wasn't getting it. I'd found a strange kind of rhythm in the quiet. I spent my evenings in the office, catching up on work, or just sitting in the backyard, listening to the birds and feeling the cool night air on my face. It was in those moments, away from his manufactured drama, that the full weight of what I had been enduring finally hit me. It wasn't just the dating apps. It wasn't just the vasectomy request. It was the realization that I had spent the better part of my middle age subsidizing a man who didn't even like me. I was the one paying for his internet connection so he could hunt for my replacement. I was the one paying for the groceries he ate while he was busy texting someone half my age. I started going through my finances, line by line. I had been so generous, so fair, that I hadn't realized how much of my own future I had been pouring into his pockets. My retirement, my savings, the equity in this house, all of it had been treated like a community chest that he was allowed to raid whenever he felt like it. I realized that if I didn't tighten the reins, there wouldn't be anything left for me when the divorce was finally finalized. That night, I made the decision to change the passwords on our joint accounts and start funneling everything into a private account he couldn't touch. It felt like a betrayal of our partnership, but then I reminded myself, he had been betraying me every single day for years. You can't break a contract that has already been shredded. The day he had his appointment arrived. He didn't ask me again, thank God. He seemed to have realized that his manipulation tactics were no longer yielding the desired results. I watched him leave the house, his gait stiff, his jaw set in a line of manufactured martyrdom. He looked like a man heading to the gallows rather than a clinic. It was pathetic, honestly. He wanted me to be the one to drive him because he wanted to feel like he still had power over me. He wanted to see me play the supportive spouse one last time, to prove that he still had the upper hand, that he was still the protagonist of our story, and I was merely a supporting character in his life. When he came back a few hours later, he looked miserable. He was hobbling, holding an ice pack against his groin, and he looked at me as I sat at the kitchen table, with a mixture of resentment and desperation. He wanted me to ask how it went. He wanted me to fuss over him, to offer him a glass of water, to help him onto the couch. I didn't move. I kept my eyes on the book in my hands. "You're unbelievable," he rasped, struggling to get comfortable on one of the kitchen chairs. "You couldn't even check on me? You couldn't even ask if I was okay?" I closed the book and looked at him, my expression completely neutral. "You made your choice and you made your arrangements," I said, my voice as flat as a board. "You're an adult, aren't you? You told me this was a medical procedure, a basic health necessity. I assume you managed just fine. Besides, I'm sure you have plenty of friends or interests who could have helped if you'd asked." His face contorted, and for a second, I thought he might actually throw something. He was livid. He started rambling about how marriage is supposed to be about support, how it's about being there when the other person is hurting. He kept coming back to that theme, support. He wanted the benefits of a marriage without the commitment of loyalty. He wanted the security of a wife without the requirement of being a husband. "It's not about the procedure," I said, cutting him off before he could get into his usual rhythm of self-pity. "It's about the fact that you have never once considered my feelings in any of this. You didn't ask if I was okay when you were on those apps. You didn't ask if I was hurt when I found out you were looking for someone younger. You never once checked on my emotional health. Why should I be your caregiver now, when you've been the one poisoning the well this entire time?" He went quiet then. He didn't have an answer for that. He just stared at the floor, his face pale, looking older and smaller than I'd ever seen him. It was a moment of profound, quiet tragedy. I wasn't just watching a divorce. I was watching the collapse of a man who had built his life on the back of someone he didn't value. He didn't know how to be a person without a pedestal to stand on. As I stood up to walk away, leaving him there with his ice pack and his silence, I realized that the anger I had been carrying for so long was beginning to evaporate. It was being replaced by something else, something much more dangerous for him, and much more liberating for me. It was indifference, the kind of total, absolute detachment that comes when you finally realize that the person in front of you simply isn't worth the emotional tax anymore. The shift to indifference was a turning point, not just for the legal separation, but for my own internal recovery. It's a strange thing, indifference. It's not necessarily cold or mean-spirited. It's just the final stage of grief. When you stop expecting someone to change, when you stop waiting for them to show the empathy you know they lack, the world suddenly becomes much quieter. For the next few weeks, the house took on the atmosphere of a tomb. We existed in parallel lines, rarely crossing, and when we did, I made sure to be as brief and businesslike as possible. He was still struggling with his recovery, and even though I knew, on a base level, that he was in pain, I felt nothing. No surge of wifely concern, no guilt for not jumping up to help him. I had spent decades being his emotional crutch, and I finally realized that all I had ever done was help him limp further away from me. One Tuesday, I came home from work to find him sitting in the living room, the lights dim, staring at his phone with that familiar, frantic intensity. The house was a mess, laundry piled on the chair, dishes in the sink. He hadn't bothered to lift a finger in days. It was a test, I knew. He was waiting for me to walk in, see the state of the place, and explode. He wanted to provoke a reaction, to engage in the old toxic dance where I would scream about his laziness and he would counter with my unreasonable demands. I didn't give it to him. I walked straight past him into the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, and began doing the dishes. But only my own. I cleared my space, wiped the counter, and then, without saying a word, walked back toward the bedroom. "Are you even going to ask?" he he called out, his voice thin and desperate. I stopped at the doorway. Ask what? How the recovery is going? How I'm feeling? You're just acting like I'm a ghost, he said, his face twisting into an expression that was halfway between anger and a whimper. I'm in pain, and you're acting like I don't exist. I turned to look at him, leaning against the doorframe. I wasn't angry anymore, which seemed to frustrate him even more than my yelling ever did. I stopped asking because I stopped caring, honestly. You made your choice to prioritize your own comfort and your own ego over our marriage for years. You treated me like a convenience store, something you could pull resources from whenever you needed a hit of validation or a place to sleep. If you're in pain, that's between you and your doctor. I'm not a part of your life anymore, and I'm certainly not your caretaker. He stood up, his face reddening. We're still married. Until those papers are signed, we have responsibilities to each other. The only responsibility I have left is to get through this divorce with my sanity intact, I replied, my voice steady. You spent years looking for a way out. You found it on those apps. You're just mad that I'm not going to be the one to pay for your cab ride to the finish line. The look on his face was a mix of shock and dawning realization. He was finally understanding that the power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had completely vanished. He had spent his life thinking he was the center of my world, the sun around which my days orbited. When he realized that the sun had set, and he was left standing in the dark, he didn't know how to cope. He started to spiral. He tried to pick fights over the smallest things, the temperature of the house, the noise of the refrigerator, the way I parked my car in the driveway. It was like he was a toddler throwing toys out of a crib, hoping to get a rise out of me. But I just stayed in my lane. I became a ghost in my own home, a silent observer of the wreckage he was making of his own life. Meanwhile, the legal side of things was moving forward. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had seen men like my husband 1,000 times before, was making quick work of the assets. Every time I had to sit down and review the paperwork, every time I had to sign a document that untangled our lives, I felt a little lighter. I was reclaiming my future. I was reclaiming the money I'd earned. I was reclaiming the peace that had been stolen from me when he decided that addiction was a valid excuse for betrayal. But there were still moments of doubt. I would look at him, this man who had been my constant for so long, and I would feel a flicker of the woman I used to be, the woman who would have rushed to help him at the first sign of discomfort. I had to consciously remind myself that that woman didn't exist anymore. She had been hollowed out, fed to the machine of his ego, and discarded. This new version of me, the one who could walk away, was the only one who was going to survive. One evening, he sat me down, or rather, he attempted to. He cleared his throat and tried to strike a tone of reasonable concern. I think we need to talk about the house, he started, his voice strained. If we're going to be living together until the divorce is final, we need to come to an agreement on how things are handled. It's not working for either of us. I sat across from him, my posture relaxed. I agree. It's not working. Which is why I've already listed the house with an agent. It goes on the market next week. His jaw dropped. He hadn't expected me to be so proactive. He had assumed I would be paralyzed by the emotional weight of it all, that I would dither and cry and drag my feet. You did what? He whispered, his face turning ashen. I listed the house, I repeated, my voice calm. I'm the breadwinner. I've paid for this roof for 30 years. I'm done paying for a home for a man who is actively looking for his next girlfriend. If you want to stay in a house, you're free to rent one. But this one is going on the market, and you have until the closing date to find somewhere else to go. The look of genuine, unadulterated panic in his eyes was something I knew I would never forget. For the first time, he realized that his game was over. He couldn't play me anymore. He couldn't use me for shelter, for money, for comfort, or for sympathy. He was officially on his own. The following weeks felt less like living in a home and more like watching a slow-motion car crash from the safety of the sidewalk. Once the for sale sign went up in the yard, the mask he had been wearing, the mask of the wounded, misunderstood husband, finally began to slip. He was no longer trying to guilt-trip me into playing nurse. He was panicked. He was realizing that I wasn't just a partner who was fed up, but a partner who had the means and the motive to pull the rug out from under him. He started coming home later, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. I knew exactly where he had been. He was out there, in the bars, on the apps, trying to find some poor, unsuspecting woman to fill the void I had left behind. He was desperate to prove to himself that he still had value, that he was still the catch he had convinced himself he was. But the truth was, he was a hollowed-out, middle-aged man with nothing to offer but drama and a dwindling bank account. I remember one night I was sitting at the kitchen island, going through my own bank statements, feeling a surge of satisfaction every time I saw a bill paid in full without his name attached to the account. He walked in, his shoulders slumped, his eyes glassy. He didn't even try to hide the phone he was clutching like a lifeline. He tossed it onto the counter and slumped into a chair. "Nobody wants this," he muttered, almost to himself. He wasn't even talking to me anymore. He was just venting his failure into the air. They all want someone younger, or someone with money, or someone who isn't a mess. I'm 56, and I'm starting over. I didn't look up. I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't say, "It'll get better." I just kept scrolling through my records. "That's what happens when you prioritize superficiality over substance," I said, my voice clinical. "You've spent years training yourself to look for the shallowest thing in every room. It makes sense that you'd end up feeling shallow." He snapped his head toward me, eyes flashing with sudden, impotent rage. "You used to be kind. You used to be the woman who would listen to me. Who turned you into this cold, heartless bitch?" I looked at him then, and for the first time, I felt a deep, profound pity. Not for his situation, but for his complete lack of self-awareness. He really, truly believed that I was the one who had changed, that I was the one who had broken our bond. He had no concept that I was simply a reflection of what he had done to me. He had spent years chipping away at the statue, and he was now horrified that it had finally collapsed into a pile of stone. "You did," I said simply. "You spent years telling me I wasn't enough, that I was too old, that you needed more. You treated our life like it was a waiting room for your real life to start. I didn't become cold. I just became honest. I stopped pretending that your addiction was a valid excuse for the way you treated me. You wanted to be free? You're free. Why aren't you happy?" He didn't have an answer. He just looked away, back to his phone, which sat dark and silent on the counter. The house sold faster than I expected. It was a seller's market, and despite his attempt to sabotage showings by being present, disheveled, and generally unpleasant, the sheer quality of the property overcame his best efforts to drive buyers away. When the final offer came in, I didn't tell him immediately. I waited until the papers were drafted. I sat him down, not as his wife, but as the owner of the house, and handed him the documents. "We close in 30 days, I said. He stared at the papers, his hands trembling. "You're serious? You're actually doing this? You're kicking me out?" "I'm not kicking you out," I corrected him. "I'm selling an asset. You have your own income, your own car, and your own phone. You've been living as a bachelor in practice for years. Now, you'll be living as one in reality." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stood up, pacing the room, talking about fairness and decades of commitment. He started listing the things he had done for me, the minor repairs, the trips we'd taken, the holidays. He was trying to build a case, to rewrite the history of our marriage as a balanced, healthy partnership that I was now destroying. "You're rewriting history," I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through his monologue. "I paid the bills. I did the laundry. I managed the household. You spent your time on dating apps and looking for ways to avoid the reality of our life. You weren't a partner. You were a dependent who resented his provider. And now, you're just a guest who has overstayed his welcome." I stood up and walked away, leaving him standing there in the middle of the kitchen. I didn't look back. I went to the guest bedroom, closed the door, and locked it. It was the best sleep I had had in years. The following days were a whirlwind of packing. I started packing my own things, putting them into boxes marked future. I didn't help him with his. I didn't offer him advice on where to move. I didn't care. I was finally, truly focused on myself. I was building a life that didn't include his excuses, his phone, or his endless, draining needs. Packing was a sensory experience that I hadn't anticipated. As I cleared out the closets and the cupboards, I wasn't just moving boxes. I was physically shedding the skin of a life I no longer recognized. Every item I wrapped in newsprint felt like a piece of my old identity being put to rest. The picture frames, the decor we'd picked out at big box stores on rainy Saturdays, the books that had been gathering dust. They all belonged to a ghost. I watched him from the hallway as he stumbled through the house. He was packing too, but with a frantic, unorganized energy. He was tossing clothes into duffel bags, throwing his gaming consoles into boxes without padding, looking like a man who had suddenly realized the storm was finally at his doorstep and he had no shelter. It wasn't the dignified exit of a man who had simply fallen out of love. It was the pathetic scramble of someone who had been living on borrowed time and was now realizing the debt was due. The day of the final walkthrough for the buyers was the coldest day of the year. I had finished moving my things into a small, temporary apartment I'd leased near the office. It was a modest place, just a few rooms, but it was mine. No history of betrayal, no memories of him sitting on the couch while he swiped through his apps. Just a quiet, clean, safe space. When I arrived at the house for the last time to ensure he was out, he was standing in the living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes, looking at his phone with a hollow stare. He looked exhausted. The bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a gray, sullen resignation. He didn't even stand up when I walked in. He just looked at me, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of the man I had first met 30 years ago. It was a fleeting, sad ghost of him, and I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me. Not for the loss of him, but for the loss of the potential we'd had. "Is that it?" I asked, gesturing to the piles of junk he was calling his life. "I don't have anywhere to go," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I mean, I have some savings, but the rental market, it's all so expensive. I don't know how I'm going to do this on my own." I stood there, my hand on the front door handle. It was the easiest thing in the world to be cruel, to tell him that he should have thought about his financial independence while he was busy spending his money on dating app subscriptions and nights out. But I didn't. I didn't need to be cruel. The truth was enough. "You're going to do it the same way you've done everything else," I said. "You'll figure it out. You're an adult. You've been an adult for 30 years and you've managed to survive. You'll manage to survive this too." I turned the key in the lock, leaving it on the counter for the real estate agent. "I'm leaving now," I said. "The keys are there. Please be out by noon. The new owners are going to be here for the handover." "Are you going to look back?" he asked, not looking at me. "No," I said, and I meant it. I walked out to my car, the biting wind whipping at my hair, and I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the windows, at the yard, at the life I had spent 3 decades building. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away. As I pulled out of the driveway, I felt a physical sensation, like a heavy, rusted shackle finally snapping off my wrist. The first night in my new apartment was surreal. I didn't have much furniture yet, just a mattress and a small table. I sat on the floor, eating a simple meal, and listened to the silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a house being held hostage by resentment. It was a light, airy, expectant silence. It was the sound of a blank page. I've been here for 2 weeks now, and my self-worth is slowly, so slowly, starting to bloom again. I didn't realize how much of myself I had pruned away to fit into his life, to accommodate his insecurities, to play the role of the supportive wife, to a man who was essentially a stranger. People talk about divorce as a failure, as the end of something. But for me, it was the beginning of my actual life. I'm rediscovering hobbies I hadn't touched in years. I'm redecorating my small space with things that make me happy, not things that serve a communal aesthetic. I'm reconnecting with friends I had pushed away because he made it difficult to host or be away from the house. Every time I look in the mirror, I don't see the woman who was worried about her husband's vasectomy or his dating apps. I see a survivor. I see a woman who stood up for her own humanity when it would have been so easy to just keep fading into the background. And the irony isn't lost on me. He spent years telling me I was the one who was too much or not enough, or that I was insecure for wanting a partner who was actually present. And now, he's out there in the world, trying to find someone who will let him play the same game, while I'm finally living in a world where I'm the only one who matters. I look at the life I'm building now, and I realize that the best revenge isn't anything spiteful or dramatic. It's just living well. It's thriving in the absence of the toxic weight. It's finally being able to breathe, fully and deeply, without wondering who is going to disappoint me next. The transition into my new life didn't happen overnight, but it felt like waking up from a decade-long fever dream. For the first few days in my apartment, I found myself instinctively reaching for my phone to check on him, to see if he'd gotten his groceries, or to wonder if he was still sulking in the dark. It was a muscle memory born of decades of being his caretaker. Every time I caught myself, I'd take a deep, shaky breath, set the phone down, and remind myself, he is not your responsibility. He never was. The real surprise came when I started to truly look around at the world again. For years, I had viewed everything through the narrow, suffocating lens of our marriage. I saw the world as a place where he was the protagonist and I was the stagehand. I had forgotten what it felt like to be the star of my own show. I started taking long walks in the park, not checking my watch to see if I needed to be home to cook dinner. I went to the cinema by myself, treating myself to the overpriced popcorn and sitting exactly where I wanted to sit, without having to negotiate his choice of movie or endure his bored, restless sighs throughout the film. It was in these small, mundane acts of autonomy that I began to feel the phantom weight of his expectations finally lift. I remember one Friday evening, I walked into a bookstore, a place he used to loathe because it was too quiet and boring, and I spent 3 hours just browsing. I bought books on subjects I'd wanted to study for years, art history and travelogues of places I'd never felt allowed to visit. When I brought them back to my apartment and laid them out on my table, I realized that for the first time in 30 years, I didn't have to justify my interests. I didn't have to explain why I wanted to spend my own money on things that made me happy. I've had a few run-ins with mutual acquaintances, people who knew us as the couple. Most of them were stunned when they heard the news, but the reactions were telling. Some were sympathetic, sure, but a surprising number of them confessed that they'd been waiting for me to leave. "We always wondered when you'd realize you were better than this," one friend told me over lunch. It was a jarring thing to hear. It meant that my pain had been visible to everyone except me. I had been carrying a neon sign of unhappiness, and I'd been the only one blind to it, because I was too busy polishing the tarnished brass of a failing marriage. The divorce itself is almost finalized now. The lawyers are wrapping up the loose ends, and there's no more fighting over the house, no more bickering over the bank accounts. It's clinical. It's efficient. It's the antithesis of the chaotic, emotional whirlpool I lived in for so long. Every time I sign a document, it feels like reclaiming another piece of my future. I've even started to notice changes in my physical self. I'm sleeping through the night for the first time in years. The constant low-level hum of anxiety that used to live in my chest, that feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the next notification to ping on his phone, waiting for the next lie, is gone. My skin looks better. My posture has improved. I'm not carrying the world on my shoulders anymore, and it turns out that makes a world of difference. It's strange, looking back at the woman who stood in that kitchen and refused to drive him to his procedure. I feel a strange, protective affection for her. She was terrified. She was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into the unknown. But she didn't jump back. She held her ground. She realized that she would rather be alone, truly alone, than be with someone who made her feel lonely. I think about the quote-unquote medical procedure now, and I just laugh. Not a bitter laugh, but a genuine one. It's so small in the grand scheme of things. It was a hurdle, a test, and I passed it. I passed it because I finally stopped centering his needs at the expense of my own soul. If you are ever in a position where you are being asked to sacrifice your dignity for the sake of someone who hasn't respected you in years, remember that you are allowed to say no. You are allowed to prioritize your own comfort, your own sanity, and your own future. You do not owe anyone the right to use you as a stepping stone. And for those of you who might be wondering, no, I haven't heard from him, and I don't care to. I've heard through the grapevine that he's struggling. He's finding out that the younger women he chased aren't interested in a 56-year-old man with no stability and a suitcase full of emotional baggage. He's finding out that the world is a much colder place when you don't have a reliable, kind-hearted woman paying your way through life. It's a hard lesson, but it's one he's having to learn on his own time with his own resources. I find myself thinking about all of you, all the people who read these stories and search for a little bit of clarity in their own lives. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you don't have to stay until there's nothing left of you. You don't have to wait until you're empty. You can leave while you still have a spark. You can leave while you still have a life to build. If you're currently in a situation that feels like it's slowly draining you, I want to ask you, what are you waiting for? Are you waiting for a sign? Or are you just waiting for the courage to finally put yourself first? Take a moment to look at your life and ask yourself if you're living it for yourself or if you're just a supporting character in someone else's drama. And if you're brave enough to answer that question honestly, you might find that the freedom you've been looking for is already right there, waiting for you to grab it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to draw a line in the sand like that? Have you ever had to choose between being the nice person and being a person who survives? Leave a comment below. I read them all, and your stories are what keep me feeling like I'm part of something real. And if you want to follow along as I keep navigating this new, beautiful, terrifying chapter, hit that subscribe button. It's just the beginning for me, and I'm so glad to have you on this journey. It's funny how, in the aftermath of a total life upheaval, you start to notice things that you previously walked right past. It's almost as if my senses were dulled by the years of chronic, low-grade misery I was conditioned to accept. Now, the colors seem sharper, the sounds more distinct, and the simple act of choosing my own path, even something as mundane as picking where to go for groceries or what to cook for dinner, feels like a defiant, revolutionary act. I saw him once, about a month after I had moved out and settled into my apartment. It was purely by chance, at a local grocery store. He didn't see me at first, and I had a split second to decide whether to walk up to him or turn around and head for the produce section. I watched him for a moment from behind a display of seasonal fruit. He looked tired. Not the kind of long day at work tired, but a deep structural exhaustion that seemed to seep into his very bones. He was wearing clothes that didn't quite fit right, and his hair, usually so meticulously combed, was messy. He was wandering the aisles with a basket that contained nothing but frozen meals and a few snacks. It was the most heartbreaking yet validating sight I had ever seen. I didn't approach him. I realized in that moment that there was nothing left to say. The anger had burned out long ago, and in its place was a profound, quiet sense of clarity. He was just a man, flawed and scared and profoundly insecure, trying to navigate a world that didn't care about his addictions or his desire to relive his youth. I realized that my refusal to drive him to his procedure hadn't been the moment our marriage ended. It was merely the moment I finally stopped pretending that he was the person I needed him to be. I walked past him, down the next aisle, and for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing. No surge of pity, no desire to fix his basket, no lingering resentment. I just felt light. I've been thinking a lot about the word selfish. For years, he used that word as a weapon against me. "You're being selfish," he'd say whenever I asked for more attention, more presence, more loyalty. "You're being selfish," he'd repeat whenever I pointed out his financial infidelity or his obsession with dating apps. I used to internalize that word. I used to spend hours lying awake, trying to figure out how to be less selfish, how to be more accommodating, more understanding, more of a doormat. But I've realized that what he called selfishness was actually just self-preservation. When you're drowning, reaching for a life raft isn't selfish. It's the only way to survive. And I had spent so long letting myself drown that I had forgotten what it felt like to actually breathe. I've started taking painting classes. I was never particularly good at it, but there's something incredibly cathartic about putting color on a blank canvas. It's about the process, not the product. I sit there for hours, not worrying about the time, not worried about who I need to be for anyone else. Just me, the brush, and the colors. It's a space where I'm allowed to make mistakes, where I'm allowed to be messy, where I'm allowed to just be. It's everything he never allowed me to have, and it's become my own little sanctuary. The legal paperwork is almost completely wrapped up now. My lawyer tells me the final decree should be signed by the end of the week. There's no bitterness, no desire for revenge. I don't want to hurt him. I just want to be done. I want the clean break. I want the chapter to be closed, the book finished, and the story to be about me and only me. I think about the younger women he was so obsessed with. I wonder if they ever realized what a hollow, empty prize they were chasing. I wonder if any of them ever saw the man I saw. The man who would look at them and see not a person, but a validation of his own fading youth. And I feel a strange sense of relief that it's not my problem anymore. He can go out into the world and try to find someone to fill that void. But he'll never find it. You can't fill a void with external validation when the problem is internal. I've learned that the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you have with yourself. I had neglected mine for so long, treating it as something secondary, something that could wait until he was happy, until he was fixed, until the marriage was stable. But the marriage was never going to be stable, because the foundation was built on his dishonesty and my silence. If you are reading this and you feel that familiar ache in your chest, the feeling that you're doing everything, giving everything, and getting nothing back, please listen to me. You are not responsible for someone else's inability to love you. You are not responsible for their addictions, their flaws, or their struggles. You are only responsible for your own life, your own joy, and your own peace. It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to reclaim your worth. Even at 52, even after 30 years, you can choose to stand up and walk away. You can choose to be the hero of your own story, rather than the victim of someone else's. I'm looking forward to the future now, not with fear, but with curiosity. I don't know what's coming next, and for the first time in my life, that doesn't terrify me. It excites me. I'm starting to see the world as a place of endless possibility, a place where I can finally, truly be free. And that freedom, it's the greatest gift I could have ever given myself. So, what about you? What would you do? If you found yourself in a position where the person you loved was asking you to facilitate their betrayal, to hold their hand while they walked away from you, would you be able to say no? Would you be able to walk away and never look back? I want to know. Tell me your stories, share your struggles, and let's keep this conversation going. Because your experiences, your truth, and your resilience are what make this all worth it. I'm grateful for every single one of you who has followed this journey, who has lent a sympathetic ear, and who has reminded me that I'm not alone in this. Your support has been the wind in my sails, the strength I needed when I felt like I was faltering. And as I close this chapter and move into the next, I want to say thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for being a part of this new, beautiful, and completely, unapologetically mine chapter. The finality of the divorce decree hitting my inbox was a strange, anticlimactic moment. After all the years of high-stakes tension, arguments, and the agonizing process of unraveling our shared life, it arrived as a simple PDF attachment. I stared at the screen for a long time, the digital signature at the bottom glowing in the dim light of my living room. It was done. The man I had spent 30 years tethered to was now officially a stranger. I thought back to that morning in our old kitchen, the morning I refused to drive him to his vasectomy. It felt like a lifetime ago. Back then, I was still looking for a flicker of recognition in his eyes, some sign that he understood the gravity of his actions. I was still operating under the delusion that if I just explained it clearly enough, or if I just stood my ground firmly enough, he would have a breakthrough. I wanted him to see me, not as his servant, but as his wife, as a human being whose heart he was systematically shattering. But as I sat there, the weight of the decree finally setting in, I realized that my refusal wasn't for him at all. It wasn't about teaching him a lesson or making him feel the weight of my absence. It was the moment I realized that his opinion of me, his reaction to my boundaries, and his internal state were all completely irrelevant to my existence. I decided to treat myself that night. I went to a nice restaurant, the kind he always complained was too expensive or too stuffy. I ordered a glass of wine and a meal I actually enjoyed, and I sat there, surrounded by the hum of conversation and the clatter of silverware, feeling completely at home in my own skin. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to scan the room to see if he was bored, or to worry about whether I was taking too long, or to apologize for my own enjoyment. I was just there, present, alive. My friends have noticed the change in me too. They tell me I seem brighter, that there's a lightness to my walk that wasn't there before. And it's true. When you stop carrying the emotional baggage of someone who doesn't respect you, you find you have so much more room to actually live. I've started traveling, taking short weekend trips to places I'd always wanted to visit. I'm rediscovering the joy of simple things. A sunset over the water, the smell of rain on the pavement, the feeling of waking up in a house that is entirely, unequivocally my own. He's still out there somewhere, I imagine, still swiping through those apps, still chasing that fleeting hit of validation, still struggling to find someone who will put up with his neediness and his lack of respect. I don't harbor any malice towards him. I don't want him to fail, but I certainly don't care if he succeeds. He is a character in a book I have already finished reading, and I am busy writing a completely different story. People often ask me, if you could go back, would you do it differently? And my answer is always the same. No. Everything I went through, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the long, slow realization of my own worth, led me to this moment. It led me to the woman I am today, strong, independent, and finally, truly happy. I had to walk through the fire to find out that I could survive it. I had to lose the life I thought I wanted to find the life I was actually meant to live. If there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's that you are the architect of your own existence. We spend so much of our lives trying to be what others want us to be. The perfect spouse, the supportive partner, the reliable caretaker, that we forget to check in with ourselves. We forget to ask, is this serving me? Is this making me a better, happier, more fulfilled person? If the answer is no, then you have the power to change it. You have the power to draw a line in the sand. You have the power to walk away from anything that makes you feel small. It's not always easy. It's often terrifying. There will be days when you question your resolve, when you wonder if you're being too harsh, or if you should have just tried one more time. But hold on to that boundary. Protect it like it's the most precious thing you own, because it is. Your boundaries are the fence that keeps your soul safe. I'm standing on the other side now, looking back at the wreckage with nothing but a quiet sense of peace. The storm is past, the sun is shining, and I am finally, for the first time in 3 decades, entirely my own. I want to thank you again for every comment, every word of encouragement, and for the way your own stories have helped me see that I was never truly alone. This community has been a lifeline, and I am so grateful to have shared this part of my life with you. We've talked about heartbreak and betrayal, but we've also talked about resilience, strength, and the beautiful, messy, wonderful process of starting over. If you're still waiting for your own turning point, know that it's coming. Trust your gut. Listen to that small, quiet voice that tells you you deserve more. Because you do. You deserve to be seen, you deserve to be respected, and most of all, you deserve to be happy. Don't let anyone hold you back. Don't let anyone make you feel like your needs are a burden. And never, ever let anyone convince you that you have to settle for less than the love and respect you give so freely to others. Your life is waiting for you. Go grab it. And as for me, I'm going to keep living, keep growing, and keep enjoying every single wonderful second of this new, beautiful chapter. I'd love to hear your final thoughts on this journey. If you found a piece of yourself in this story, let me know in the comments. And if you're looking for more stories about rediscovery and the power of walking away, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We're in this together, and I can't wait to see what's next for all of us.